The taste of recycled air and desperation still clings to my throat from when I first felt their eyes upon me. My name is John, but the whole fucking world knows me as Homelander. I'm the strongest, fastest, most perfect being ever created. I can level city blocks with my heat vision, crush tanks with my bare hands, and fly faster than fighter jets. You think that makes me invincible, but you don't know what I've seen in this nightmare realm they call the 41st millennium. In my world, I was a god among insects. Here, I'm just another piece of meat in a galaxy where gods actually exist, and they're all trying to kill each other. Space Marines that make me look weak. Demons that would drive me insane just by existing near them. And somewhere in the dark, something called the Emperor who makes even my worst narcissistic fantasies look pathetic. This is my testimony of survival in hell itself. Chapter 1. Perfect Arrival. I materialized in what I thought was another shitty movie set until the smell hit me. Not the fake Hollywood smoke and mirrors I was used to, but something far more visceral. The stench of decay, burning promethium, and 10,000 years of accumulated human suffering. The sky above me wasn't blue, but a sickly yellow-brown, choked with industrial smog that would have killed a normal person in minutes. But I wasn't a normal person. I was Homelander, and breathing toxic air was just another Tuesday for someone with my enhanced physiology. What concerned me more was the distinct lack of cameras, cheering crowds, or terrified executives scrambling to kiss my ass. Instead, I found myself standing in what looked like the world's worst urban planning nightmare. Towering spires of rusted metal and ceramite stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the polluted atmosphere like the fever dreams of a depressed architect. Gothic cathedrals the size of mountains squatted between factory complexes that belched flame and smoke with religious fervor. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were skulls, carved into walls, mounted on spikes, worn as decorations, embedded in the architecture itself, like some psychotic designer's signature. "What the fuck is this place?" I muttered, my voice echoing strangely in the oppressive atmosphere. A sound caught my attention. The rhythmic pounding of boots on metal. Lots of boots, all moving in perfect synchronization like some kind of militaristic wet dream. I used my enhanced hearing to track them, following the sound around a corner until I saw something that made even my superior mind take a moment to process. They were soldiers, but calling them soldiers was like calling a nuclear bomb a firecracker. Each one stood over 8 feet tall, encased in power armor that looked like it had been forged in hell and blessed by a death cult. Their shoulders were easily 3 feet wide, covered in ceramite plates decorated with more skulls, purity seals, and religious iconography than a Spanish Inquisition fever dream. Space Marines. Even with my complete lack of context about this place, something in my enhanced brain recognized these beings as apex predators. They moved with the fluid grace of natural killers, each step calculated, each gesture precise. Their helmets were works of art dedicated to intimidation. Snarling death masks with glowing red eye lenses that tracked potential threats with mechanical precision. The leader, distinguished by a magnificent cape and even more elaborate skull decorations, raised his hand in what I assumed was a greeting. Instead, he spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being chewed by a garbage disposal. "Halt, citizen. Identify yourself and state your business in this sector." Citizen. Citizen. I was Homelander, the greatest hero who ever lived, the face of Vault International, the star of 100 movies and merchandise lines. I didn't get called citizen by anyone, let alone some oversized cosplayers with anger management issues. "Listen here, you fucking tin can," I said, floating up to eye level with the sergeant. "I don't know what kind of budget production this is, but I'm Homelander. The Homelander. Now point me toward whoever's in charge so I can figure out how to get back to civilization." The Space Marines exchanged glances that somehow conveyed entire conversations, despite their faces being hidden behind ceramite death masks. The sergeant tilted his head slightly, studying me with the kind of analytical attention usually reserved for particularly interesting insects. "Unknown Xenos or mutant detected. he announced to his squad with the casual tone of someone ordering coffee. Exhibiting signs of potential psychic corruption. Recommend immediate purification protocols. Before I could ask what the hell purification protocols meant, 20 bolt guns were aimed at my head. Not small arms like the pathetic weapons carried by normal soldiers, but massive firearms that looked like they could punch holes through tank armor. Which, I would later learn, was exactly what they were designed to do. Whoa, whoa, whoa! I held up my hands in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. Let's all take a deep breath here. I'm not a fucking alien or whatever you think I am. I'm an American, red, white, and blue, born and raised in the greatest country on earth. Terror, the sergeant corrected with mechanical precision. And your claims of planetary origin are irrelevant. You exhibit non-human capabilities and unauthorized flight patterns. By the authority of the God Emperor of mankind, you will submit to immediate examination or face termination. God Emperor. These people were clearly suffering from some kind of mass psychosis, probably brought on by whatever environmental disaster had turned their planet into this hellscape. But even my enhanced intellect couldn't immediately process the sheer scale of fanaticism I was dealing with. Look, I get it, I said, trying the reasonable approach. You guys have some kind of religious thing going on. Very impressive. The skulls, the Gothic architecture, the whole death cult aesthetic, very metal. But I'm not looking for trouble. Just point me toward the nearest airport or spaceport or whatever you use for transportation, and I'll be out of your hair. The sergeant's helmet tilted again, and I realized with growing unease that these weren't costumes. The power armor was real, functional, and judging by the subtle energy readings my enhanced senses were picking up, capable of enhancing already superhuman physiques to levels that might actually pose a challenge even to me. Spaceport access requires proper documentation and Imperial clearance, he said, with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. As you appear to lack both identification and comprehension of basic Imperial law, you will accompany us to the nearest administratum facility for processing. I'm not going anywhere with you psychos, I said, allowing my heat vision to charge. The familiar warmth built behind my eyes, ready to demonstrate why I was called the strongest man alive. But I'll give you one chance to walk away before this gets ugly. 20 bolt guns tracked my movement with mechanical precision. The sergeant raised one gauntleted hand, and I caught the faint whir of targeting systems activating. Threatening Imperial personnel with prohibited psychic manifestations constitutes heresy of the highest order, he announced with the same tone someone might use to report the weather. You have been found guilty by association, thought and deed. Your sentence is death. The bolt guns fired. I'd been shot before, of course, countless times by terrorists, villains, and the occasional overzealous fan. Bullets bounced off my skin like raindrops. Explosions tickled, and tank shells were amusing distractions. But the moment those bolt rounds hit me, I realized I wasn't in Kansas anymore. Each projectile was a small rocket, accelerating after leaving the barrel and detonating with shaped charges designed to punch through the heaviest armor. They hit me with enough force to actually move me backward, something that hadn't happened since my creation. The explosions scorched my uniform and sent feedback through my enhanced nervous system that could generously be described as uncomfortable. I wasn't seriously injured, but for the first time in my adult life, I had been hurt by conventional weapons. And these Space Marines were looking at the scorch marks on my chest with the clinical interest of scientists observing an unexpected experimental result. Target exhibits enhanced durability, the sergeant observed, already adjusting his squad's tactical approach. Resistance to standard bolt munitions confirmed, requesting heavy weapons authorization. Heavy weapons? If their standard ammunition could actually affect me, I didn't want to find out what their heavy weapons could do. Time for a strategic withdrawal and some serious reconsideration of my situation. I launched myself skyward, accelerating to supersonic speed in seconds. The familiar sensation of flight helped calm my rattled nerves as I climbed above the industrial nightmare below. From this height, I could see the true scope of whatever madhouse I'd stumbled into. The city, if it could be called a city, stretched to every horizon. Massive hab blocks rose like concrete mountains, housing billions of people in conditions that made the worst slums look luxurious. Factory complexes belched toxic smoke that formed its own weather patterns. And everywhere, the imperial symbols I was beginning to recognize. Eagles with two heads, skulls mounted on spikes, Gothic cathedrals that served as fortresses. But what really caught my attention were the ships. Massive vessels hung in the atmosphere like cathedrals given flight, their hulls bristling with weapon batteries that could level continents. They moved with ponderous grace through the toxic sky, their presence a constant reminder that this wasn't just a city, but a military installation of unimaginable scale. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't dealing with some isolated group of religious fanatics. This was an entire civilization built around concepts that made my worst PR disasters look like minor social media mishaps. And judging by the way those space marines had reacted to my presence, I was now officially an enemy of whatever passed for government in this place. My enhanced hearing picked up a new sound, the whine of aircraft engines approaching fast. I turned to see fighter craft that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a serious grudge against the concept of aerodynamics. They were flying Gothic cathedrals with engines, bristling with weapons and covered in the same skull motifs that decorated everything else in this madhouse. The lead fighter opened a communication channel, and a voice that sounded like it had been processed through a Vox grill spoke with mechanical authority. Unidentified flying object, you are in violation of airspace restrictions. Descend immediately for inspection or face termination. I was getting really tired of being threatened by people in ridiculous costumes. Time to show these tin-plated idiots what happened when they messed with someone who had laser vision. I charged my heat vision to full power and let loose with twin beams of concentrated energy that had melted through bank vaults and vaporized terrorists. The beams struck the lead fighter's hull and left scorch marks. Actual, visible damage, but the aircraft continued flying as if I'd hit it with a flashlight. The pilot's response was immediate and educational. Las cannons opened fire, concentrated energy beams that turned the air itself into plasma. I rolled aside, feeling the heat wash over me as the beams passed close enough to singe my cape. These people had energy weapons that actually worked, and they were using them with the casual efficiency of professionals. This wasn't a movie set or an elaborate prank. This was a real place with real weapons and real soldiers who considered me a legitimate threat, which meant I needed to start taking them seriously before they escalated to whatever heavy weapons that sergeant had mentioned. I dove toward the city's surface, weaving between the massive spires and using my superior maneuverability to break the fighters' targeting solutions. My enhanced brain was already analyzing everything I'd seen, building a picture of this world that was both fascinating and terrifying. These people had technology that put Vort's best innovations to shame, but they used it with the mindset of medieval crusaders. They had energy weapons, power armor, and spacecraft, but everything was decorated like a Gothic cathedral designed by someone with serious psychological issues. And they called their leader the God Emperor, which suggested a level of megalomania that even I found impressive. But most importantly, they had hurt me. Not seriously, but enough to prove that their weapons could actually affect someone with my enhanced physiology. In a universe where that was possible, I needed to completely recalibrate my approach to survival. I was still Homelander, still the strongest, fastest, most perfect being ever created. But in this nightmare realm, that might not be enough to guarantee the worship and adoration I deserved. I was going to have to be smart about this, which unfortunately meant actually thinking instead of just burning things until people did what I wanted. The thought of having to use strategy instead of overwhelming superiority was almost as disturbing as the realization that I might not be the apex predator I'd always believed myself to be. But I was nothing if not adaptable. And if this emperor wanted to play God, he was about to learn what happened when a real superior being decided to take over his playground. Chapter 2. Divine Hierarchy. Finding information in this Gothic nightmare turned out to be surprisingly easy once I learned to speak their language. The key was understanding that everything in this universe was built around three simple concepts: blind obedience, paranoid suspicion, and really elaborate ways to kill people who disagreed with you. I'd managed to lose the fighters by diving into the maze of industrial complexes that form the city's foundation. Down here, between the massive machinery and toxic waste dumps, I found something that was apparently universal across all realities. People willing to sell information for the right price. The Underhive, as they called it, was a sprawling network of tunnels, abandoned factories, and improvised settlements that existed beneath the proper city above. It was populated by gangs, criminals, outcasts, and the kinds of people who asked very few questions as long as you could pay their fees. I'd traded some precious metals I'd synthesized using my enhanced control over molecular structures. Apparently gold was still valuable even in this hellscape, for a crash course in imperial politics from a black market information broker named Vex. She was augmented with cybernetic implants that made her look like a particularly enthusiastic electronics hobbyist had decided to upgrade a human being. But her data was comprehensive. "So let me get this straight," I said, reviewing the holographic displays she'd projected from her skull-mounted cogitator. "This Emperor guy rules over 1,000,000 worlds." "More than that, sweetmeat," Vex cackled, her mechanical larynx making her voice sound like a rusty gate opening. 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, master of humanity, guardian against the darkness. Though some say he's more corpse than god these days, the implications were staggering. I'd thought being the most famous person in America was impressive, but this Emperor character was apparently worshipped by quadrillions of people across the entire galaxy. The scale was beyond anything my enhanced imagination had conceived. And these space marines I ran into? They work for him? Adeptus Astartes, she corrected, mechanical fingers dancing across holographic controls. Post-human warriors created in the Emperor's image, each one worth 1,000 normal soldiers. They're his angels of death, bringing imperial truth to those who need convincing. The information dump continued for hours, painting a picture of a universe so vast and brutal that even my superior intellect struggled to process it all. Billions of worlds locked in eternal war, alien species that viewed humanity as either food or pest control, demons from another dimension that fed on emotion and corrupted reality itself. And overseeing it all, an emperor who had supposedly been the strongest psychic being in human history before being interred on a life support system that required the sacrifice of 1,000 people daily just to keep functioning. It was the kind of megalomaniacal power structure that I couldn't help but admire, even as I realized it represented competition on a scale I'd never imagined. "What about this God Emperor title?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "How exactly does that work? Is he actually divine, or is it more of a marketing thing?" Vex's augmented eyes whirred as they focused on me with mechanical precision. "Careful with that kind of talk, off-worlder. Questioning the Emperor's divinity is heresy, and heresy means death. Messy, unpleasant death involving flamers and prayers." But she leaned closer anyway, her cybernetic voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, though, there's debate. Some say he was just a very powerful man who unified terror through superior firepower and tactics. Others claim he was born divine, walking among humanity for 40,000 years before revealing himself. The ecclesiarchy preaches that his sacrifice on the Golden Throne elevated him to true godhood. And what do you think?" Her mechanical laugh was like gears grinding. "I think it doesn't matter what I think, sweetmeat. What matters is what everyone else believes, and they believe he's divine enough to power a galaxy-spanning empire through sheer force of worship." The conversation continued as she showed me propaganda reels from the Imperial cult. I watched holographic recordings of massive cathedrals filled with billions of worshippers, their prayers rising in synchronized harmony to praise an emperor they would never see. Processions of flagellants whipping themselves bloody in demonstrations of faith. Missionaries burning entire civilizations to cleanse them of false beliefs. It was exactly the kind of worship I'd always craved, but amplified beyond anything I'd dreamed possible. This emperor didn't just have fans or followers. He had an entire species that considered him the literal incarnation of divine will. Every prayer, every act of faith, Every moment of worship was directed toward him with an intensity that made my most devoted supporters look casual. And apparently, it worked. The technical readouts Vex showed me indicated that the Emperor's psychic presence was measurable across the entire galaxy. His consciousness touched every human soul, guided the navigation of interstellar travel, and held back things from another dimension that wanted to devour reality itself. "How do I meet him?" I asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. Vex's augmented features twisted into something resembling amusement. "You don't. The Emperor hasn't spoken to anyone in 10 millennia. He sits on the golden throne on Terra, sustaining the Astronomicon and keeping the demons at bay. The High Lords of Terra administer the Imperium in his name, but even they rarely approach the throne room. But theoretically, if someone were to travel to Terra, could they get an audience? Theoretically." Vex's mechanical eyes clicked as they recalibrated. "If you're a Primarch returning from the dead, maybe. If you're a living saint performing miracles in his name, possibly. If you're some random off-worlder with delusions of grandeur." She laughed again, the sound like metal scraping stone. "You'd be shot by palace guards before you made it past the orbital defenses." The challenge was becoming clear. In my world, I'd been unique, the only being with superhuman abilities, the only one who could fly or fire laser beams from his eyes. Here, I was apparently just another enhanced individual in a universe full of psychers, space marines, and things called living saints, who could allegedly perform actual miracles. But I was still Homelander, and I hadn't become the most powerful person in America by accepting limitations. If this Emperor could command worship from quadrillions of people, then clearly there was a formula for divine recognition that could be learned and applied. "Tell me about these living saints," I said, settling in for what I suspected would be a very educational conversation. The data files Vex accessed painted a fascinating picture. Living saints were apparently mortals who had been blessed by the Emperor himself, granted supernatural abilities that allowed them to perform miracles in his name. They could heal the sick, purify corruption, and inspire ordinary humans to acts of extraordinary heroism. Most importantly, they were worshipped almost as much as the Emperor himself. "Saint Celestine," Vex narrated, as holographic images showed a woman wreathed in golden light, wielding a flaming sword and sporting massive mechanical wings. "Died in battle against heretics, returned to life through the Emperor's will. She can resurrect the dead, purify demons, and inspire entire armies to victory through her mere presence." The recordings showed Celestine in action, and I had to admit the special effects were impressive. Beams of golden light that actually healed injuries, wings that weren't just decorative but actually functional, and an aura of divine authority that made hardened soldiers weep with religious ecstasy. Of course, I could do most of that already. My heat vision could be adjusted to cauterize wounds instead of causing them. My flight was certainly more elegant than those mechanical wings, and I'd been inspiring people to worship me for years, even without divine backing. "How does one become a living saint?" I asked with carefully calculated curiosity. "Faith," Vex replied simply. "Absolute, unwavering faith in the Emperor's divine will, usually combined with martyrdom, resurrection, and public miracles that can't be explained by conventional means. I could work with that. Faith was just another word for public relations, and I'd been managing my public image for decades. Martyrdom was theatrical. Resurrection would be easy enough to fake with my enhanced physiology, and miracles were just superhuman abilities wrapped in religious packaging. The real challenge would be positioning myself within the existing power structure without immediately being branded as a heretic and shot full of those bolt rounds that had actually managed to hurt me. "What about someone who already has miraculous abilities?" I pressed. "Say, hypothetically, someone who could fly and project energy beams. How would the Imperium view someone like that?" Vex's augmented features grew more serious. "Depends on the source of the abilities. If they're psyker powers, then it's either training with the Scholastica Psychona or execution, depending on power level and control. If they're tech heresy, it's immediate purification. If they're Xenos contamination, it's death by fire. And if they're divine gifts, then they'd better be able to prove it, because the ecclesiarchy doesn't take kindly to false prophets. Claims of divine blessing require extensive testing, theological review, and usually some kind of public miracle that can't be disputed. I was beginning to see the path forward. The Imperium of Man was essentially a massive religious organization with the military power to enforce its beliefs across the galaxy. Like any large organization, it had procedures, hierarchies, and established methods for handling unusual situations. I just needed to approach this like any other corporate merger or hostile takeover, except instead of acquiring a company, I was planning to acquire divine status in a galaxy-spanning empire. One last question, I said, as I prepared to leave Vex's cramped information den. What happens to people who claim to receive direct visions from the Emperor? If they're lucky, they get investigated by the Ordo Hereticus and either validated or executed. If they're unlucky, she grinned, showing teeth that had been replaced with sharpened metal implants. They get investigated by the Ordo Hereticus and either executed or recruited. I made a mental note to research these Ordo organizations as I left the Underhive and began planning my ascension to divine status. The Emperor might have a 10,000-year head start on galactic worship, but he was apparently a corpse on a throne who hadn't spoken to anyone in millennia. I, on the other hand, was very much alive, very photogenic, and very eager to receive the worship I deserved. It was time to introduce the Imperium of Man to their new, improved God Emperor. The only question was whether I should start with small miracles and work my way up, or go big from the beginning and claim my rightful place through superior firepower and divine authority. Given what I'd learned about imperial culture, I was leaning heavily toward the firepower option. Chapter 3. Heretical Ambitions. My first attempt at divine intervention went exactly as well as you might expect when dealing with a civilization that had been perfecting the art of violent paranoia for 10,000 years. I'd chosen my target carefully, a massive cathedral factory called the Shrine of the Sacred Cogitator, where hundreds of thousands of workers toiled in shifts that lasted days, producing computer components while chanting prayers to the machine god. It was exactly the kind of place where a miraculous appearance would have maximum impact, visible to massive crowds, religiously significant, and equipped with the kind of recording equipment that would spread my message across the sector. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would appear during the morning prayer service, demonstrate my divine abilities through a combination of flight, heat vision, and superhuman strength, then announce myself as the Emperor's chosen messenger. The workers would be so overwhelmed by my obvious divinity that word would spread throughout the Hive city, eventually reaching the planetary governor and the local ecclesiarchy leadership. What I hadn't anticipated was that Imperial citizens were apparently trained from birth to respond to unauthorized supernatural manifestations by shooting first and asking theological questions later. The moment I descended from the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, wreathed in the golden glow of my heat vision set to its most impressive non-lethal setting, approximately 10,000 workers reached for weapons I hadn't realized they were carrying. Lasguns, auto pistols, industrial plasma cutters, and what appeared to be blessed screwdrivers with bayonet attachments. "Behold!" I announced in my most commanding voice, hovering 20 feet above the main altar, while my cape billowed dramatically in the recycled air currents. "I am the herald of the God Emperor, sent to bring his divine message to the faithful." The response was immediate and deafening. "Daemon! Daemon! Burn the heretic!" 10,000 voices screaming in unison, while 10,000 weapons opened fire, created a sensory experience that even my enhanced physiology found overwhelming. Las beams turned the air into a light show that would have been beautiful if they weren't all aimed at me. Autogun rounds created a metallic storm that actually managed to sting when they hit my exposed skin. And the plasma cutters, those actually hurt. I tried to maintain my divine dignity while dodging industrial-grade energy weapons wielded by what were apparently the galaxy's most enthusiastic amateur demonologists. "Wait, I'm on your side. I serve the Emperor." "Lies and corruption," screamed someone who might have been a foreman, judging by his elaborate mechanical augmentations and the power maul crackling with electrical energy. "Purge the unclean!" The crowd pressed closer, and I realized with growing alarm that these weren't just frightened workers. They were moving with the coordinated precision of people who had clearly done this before. Multiple times. With enthusiasm, banners appeared from nowhere, massive cloth displays depicting the Imperial Aquila, skull motifs, and what appeared to be instructional diagrams for proper demon-burning techniques. Someone started playing hymns through the cathedral's audio system, the kind of martial religious music that made it very clear this was considered a holy war rather than a customer service issue. I ascended higher, trying to get out of range of the smaller weapons while maintaining my dignity. Listen to reason. Would a demon quote imperial scripture? "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. See, I know your beliefs." "Daemons lie," came the thunderous response. "Suffering is prayer. Death to the false prophet." The situation was rapidly escalating beyond my ability to control through words alone. I needed to demonstrate my divine authority through action, but everything I'd learned about imperial culture suggested that any display of supernatural power would just convince them more thoroughly that I was some kind of chaos entity. That's when the Adeptus Sororitas arrived, the battle sisters of the orders. Militant, moved like armored angels of death, their white and red power armor gleaming with purity seals and sacred scripture. They flowed into the cathedral with fluid precision, bolt guns tracking potential targets, while their leader, distinguished by a magnificent helmet shaped like a stylized skull, assessed the situation with tactical efficiency. "Citizens!" Her voice boomed through vox amplifiers built into her armor. "Withdraw to safe distance. This is now an ecclesiarchy matter." The crowd reluctantly pulled back, though I noticed they kept their weapons ready and continued singing hymns about burning heretics. The Sister Superior raised her bolt gun and aimed it directly at my center of mass with the kind of steady grip that suggested extensive practice at shooting flying targets. "Unknown entity," she announced with mechanical authority. "You are in violation of Imperial law regarding unauthorized supernatural manifestations. Surrender for ecclesiastical examination or face purification." I tried one more time to establish my legitimacy through proper channels. "Sister, I am here on divine mission. I bear the Emperor's blessing and come with messages of his will. Surely we can discuss this like rational servants of the throne." Her helmet tilted slightly, and I caught the faint whir of targeting systems activating. Rational discussion is not protocol for potential demon incursions. Present documented authorization from the Ordo Hereticus. Submit to psychic examination by sanctioned personnel, or prepare for immediate termination. Documentation. Of course, in a bureaucracy spanning 1,000,000 worlds, even divine interventions required proper paperwork. "I don't have documentation," I admitted, trying to project calm authority. "I was sent directly by the Emperor's will. Surely his divine command supersedes administrative requirements." Negative. The Sister Superior's response was immediate and absolute. "Claims of direct divine communication without proper validation constitute heresy of the highest order. You have 10 seconds to comply with surrender protocols." The countdown began with mechanical precision, and I realized that my carefully planned debut as a living saint was about to end with me being shot by a group of heavily armed nuns in power armor. The irony would have been amusing if not for the very real possibility that their weapons might actually be capable of causing me serious harm. I could fight, of course. My heat vision could probably cut through their armor, and my superhuman strength would give me significant advantages in close combat. But killing Imperial soldiers, especially ones associated with the ecclesiarchy, would immediately brand me as a heretic beyond any possibility of redemption. The alternative was surrender and whatever ecclesiastical examination involved. Given what I'd learned about Imperial attitudes towards supernatural phenomena, this likely meant torture, invasive psychic probing, and eventual execution if I couldn't prove my divine legitimacy to their satisfaction. Neither option offered a clear path to the galactic worship I deserved. 5 seconds, the Sister Superior announced, her bolt gun steady as granite. That's when inspiration struck. If direct claims of divinity were heretical without documentation, then perhaps I needed to approach this from a different angle. Instead of claiming to be divine, I could position myself as someone seeking divine guidance through proper channels. "Wait," I said, slowly descending toward the cathedral floor with my hands raised in a gesture of peaceful surrender. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not claiming divine authority. I'm seeking ecclesiastical guidance about supernatural experiences I've been having." The Sister Superior's helmet tilted again, but her weapon remained trained on me. "Elaborate." "I've been experiencing visions," I said, improvising rapidly while drawing on everything I'd learned about imperial theology. "Dreams of the Golden Throne, messages that might be from the Emperor himself. I came here seeking proper spiritual counseling to determine if these experiences are genuine divine communication or something else." It was a calculated risk. By framing my supernatural abilities as something I was uncertain about rather than something I was proudly displaying, I positioned myself as a potential asset rather than an immediate threat. Imperial culture seemed to value humility and submission to authority, especially when dealing with matters of faith. "You claim to receive visions from the God Emperor?" The Sister Superior's voice carried a note of interest rather than immediate hostility. "I claim to have experiences I don't understand," I replied carefully. "Abilities that manifested without training or explanation. I seek guidance from those with proper theological authority to determine their source and meaning." The crowd around us had grown quiet, sensing that the situation was shifting from immediate purge to theological evaluation. The Sister Superior lowered her bolt gun slightly and activated what appeared to be a communication device built into her helmet. "Sister Palatine Evangeline," she spoke into the Voxcaster, requesting guidance on potential psychomanifestation with claimed divine visions. "Subject demonstrates flight capability and energy projection, seeks ecclesiastical evaluation." There was a pause filled with static and what sounded like chanted prayers, then a response in High Gothic that I couldn't quite follow. The Sister Superior nodded once and closed the communication channel. "You will accompany us to the Cathedral of St. Drusilla for theological examination," she announced. "Any attempt to escape or demonstrate further unauthorized abilities will result in immediate execution. Do you understand these terms?" I nodded, trying to project the appropriate mixture of humility and eagerness for proper spiritual guidance. "I understand, Sister. I seek only to serve the Emperor's will and determine the nature of these experiences." As the Battle Sisters formed up around me in a formation that was clearly designed for prisoner transport rather than honor guard duty, I reflected on the rapid evolution of my plans. Direct claims of divinity had proven inadvisable, but positioning myself as someone seeking validation for potentially divine gifts was apparently acceptable within Imperial protocol. The key insight was that this civilization's massive bureaucracy actually created opportunities for those clever enough to navigate its systems. The Imperium was so vast and complex that it had procedures for every conceivable situation, including the evaluation of individuals claiming supernatural experiences. I just needed to pass their tests and convince the right authorities that my abilities were divine in origin rather than heretical. Once I had official ecclesiastical backing, I could begin building the cult of personality that would eventually elevate me to the worship I deserved. As we marched through the Hive City's Gothic corridors, surrounded by armed nuns chanting prayers under their breath, I began planning my next performance. The ecclesiastical examination would be my audition for divine status, and I intended to give them a show they would never forget. After all, I was Homelander. I'd been managing my public image and manipulating religious authority figures for years. How different could it be when the stakes were galactic rather than merely global? The answer to that question, I would soon discover, was considerably more complicated than expected. Chapter 4: Trial by Fire. The Cathedral of St. Drusilla was less a building and more a theological weapon disguised as architecture. Massive spires twisted skyward like prayers made manifest in stone and steel, each one topped with massive statues depicting saints, in various states of martyrdom. The main entrance was guarded by doors that stood 50 feet high, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of black marble and decorated with reliefs showing the Emperor's victories over various enemies of humanity. Inside, the scale was even more overwhelming. The nave stretched for what must have been miles, lined with columns that could have supported mountains. Thousands of candles provided flickering illumination that cast dancing shadows across frescoes depicting 10 millennia of imperial history. And everywhere, the smell of incense so thick it was almost solid, mixed with something I couldn't quite identify until I realized it was the scent of absolute faith made manifest. Sister Superior Cassandra, she'd finally introduced herself during the march through the city, led me toward what she called the Chamber of Theological Inquiry. Based on the name alone, I was expecting something like an office or conference room. What I found was a space that looked like it had been designed by someone who took the phrase "trial by fire" literally. The chamber was circular, surrounded by tiered seating that could accommodate hundreds of observers. At the center, a raised platform of black stone was marked with religious symbols I was beginning to recognize. The imperial aquila, skull motifs, and intricate patterns that seemed to writhe when viewed directly. Above it all, a massive stained glass window depicted the Emperor in golden armor, his face hidden behind an elaborate halo, but his presence unmistakably divine. Already seated in the observation area were figures that radiated authority even at a distance, robed priests whose augmentations suggested intimate communion with the machine god, battle sisters whose power armor bore the marks of decades of successful heretic purging. And in the center of it all, a figure whose presence made even my enhanced senses recoil. Inquisitor. Vex Thanatos, of the Ordo Hereticus, was everything I'd been warned about and worse. Her power armor was black as deep space, decorated with silver skulls and purity seals written in languages that hurt to read. Her face was hidden behind a mask that resembled a stylized death's head, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested she'd undergone augmentations that went beyond the merely mechanical. "So," she said as I was escorted to the platform's center, "you claim to receive visions from the God Emperor himself." "I claim to have experiences I don't understand," I corrected, sticking to the story that had gotten me this far. "I seek proper theological guidance to determine their nature and source." How convenient. The Inquisitor's mask tilted slightly, and I caught the gleam of optics that were definitely not standard human eyes. "Tell me, alleged visionary, what form do these supposed divine communications take?" I'd prepared for this question during the march to the cathedral. Dreams, mostly. Images of a golden throne room, a figure in magnificent armor, words spoken in voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. And sometimes, when I concentrate, I can feel something. A presence that might be watching me. It was vague enough to be plausible, while specific enough to suggest genuine supernatural experience. I'd drawn on every religious text I'd ever read, every description of divine visions from human history, and wrapped it all in the kind of humble uncertainty that seemed to be valued in imperial culture. "Demonstrate these abilities you claim to possess," the Inquisitor commanded. "Show us what you believe to be divine gifts." This was the crucial moment. I needed to display my capabilities in a way that suggested divine origin, while avoiding anything that might be interpreted as heretical or demon-related. Based on my research into imperial theology, divine power typically manifested as healing, purification, or protection rather than destruction. I began with flight, rising slowly from the platform, while keeping my movements graceful and purposeful rather than flashy. "In my visions, I see angels attending the Emperor's throne," I said, as I hovered 20 feet above the assembled observers. "Sometimes I dream that I am among them, serving his will across the galaxy." Murmurs arose from the crowd, but they seemed more intrigued than hostile. Flight was apparently rare enough to be impressive without being immediately heretical. Next, I carefully modulated my heat vision, reducing the intensity until it produced warm, golden light rather than destructive energy beams. The Emperor's presence in my dreams is always accompanied by light, I continued, allowing the glow to emanate from my eyes like a gentle sunrise. Pure illumination that drives away darkness and corruption. The effect on the assembled clergy was immediate and gratifying. Several of the priests began murmuring prayers, and I caught glimpses of religious iconography being touched or kissed. Even the battle sisters seemed impressed, their weapons lowering slightly as they witnessed what appeared to be genuine divine manifestation. But Inquisitor Thanatos was not so easily convinced. "Pretty lights and basic levitation," she said with mechanical disdain. "Psyche disciplines that any untrained weird could stumble across. Where is the proof of divine origin? Where are the miracles that mark true servants of the throne?" The challenge was clear. Parlor tricks weren't enough to convince an inquisitor who'd probably seen every possible form of supernatural fraud. I needed to demonstrate something that couldn't be explained away as mere psychic ability. I descended to the platform and approached the nearest battle sister, Sister Palatine Evangeline, whose power armor bore the scorch marks of recent combat. "Sister, would you permit me to attempt something? With your permission and under the Inquisitor's observation?" Evangeline glanced toward the Inquisitor, who nodded once. "Proceed," the Sister Palatine said, though her hand remained near her bolt pistol. I placed my hands on the damaged sections of her armor, areas where lasfire had burned through ceramite plating and exposed the underlying mechanisms. Then I did something I'd never tried before. I used my enhanced molecular control not to destroy, but to repair. It required incredible concentration, manually restructuring damaged materials at the atomic level while maintaining the complex patterns that made Imperial technology function. But slowly, the scorch marks began to fade. Damaged ceramite regained its original luster. Broken components reconnected with precision that would have impressed the finest tech priests. The effect on the audience was electric. Battle sisters, who had seen their own equipment repaired through months of ritual maintenance and blessed oils, watched in awe as armor that should have required complete replacement was restored to perfect condition in minutes. "The machine god's blessing," someone whispered in the crowd. "Divine restoration," another voice murmured. But Inquisitor Thanatos remained unmoved. "Impressive," she admitted. "But technological manipulation could indicate tech heresy rather than divine blessing. You will submit to psychic examination to determine the source of your abilities." Before I could respond, she raised a device that looked like a cross between a scanner and an instrument of torture. Energy readings flowed across its display as it analyzed whatever passed for my soul in this universe. "Curious," she said after several minutes of examination. "Your psychic signature is unusual, powerful, but structured in ways I've never encountered. No trace of chaos corruption, no evidence of demonic influence. If anything, your aura resembles..." She paused, consulting the device's readings. "This is unprecedented." "What is it?" Sister Palatine Evangeline asked. "His psychic pattern matches theoretical models for what we might expect from direct divine blessing," the Inquisitor said slowly. "Not psyker abilities, not tech heresy, but something that appears to be genuinely supernatural in origin." The chamber fell silent except for the distant sound of hymns echoing from the cathedral's main nave. I could see the assembled clergy exchanging glances that spoke of theological implications beyond my immediate understanding. "There is one final test," Inquisitor Thanatos announced. "If you truly bear the Emperor's blessing, you should be able to detect and resist chaos corruption. Sister Palatine, bring the relic." Evangeline disappeared into a side chamber and returned carrying what appeared to be a sealed container marked with warning symbols. When she opened it, the contents made every enhanced sense I possessed scream in alarm. The artifact inside was wrong in ways that defied description. It looked like jewelry, but its geometry hurt to perceive directly. Beautiful and horrific simultaneously, it radiated malevolence so concentrated that even looking at it felt like a violation of natural law. "A chaos artifact recovered from a heretic cult," the Inquisitor explained as she used blessed tongs to lift it from its container. Genuine servants of the Emperor should find its presence intolerable. Approach it. This was clearly a test with potentially lethal consequences. If I was corrupted by chaos, the artifact would probably enhance that corruption until I became something that needed immediate purging. If I wasn't protected by genuine divine blessing, proximity to concentrated evil might drive me insane or worse. But I was Homelander, and I'd built my entire identity on the conviction that I was superior to any challenge. I approached the artifact with steady confidence, even as every instinct screamed at me to flee. The closer I got, the worse it became. The thing whispered promises of power, pleasure, knowledge, and decay in voices that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to whatever constituted my soul. It offered me things I hadn't known I wanted and showed me possibilities that made my darkest fantasies look innocent. But underneath it all, I felt something else. A warmth that seemed to emanate from within my own being. A light that pushed back against the artifact's corruption. Not my heat vision or any of my known abilities, but something new. As if my very presence in this universe had awakened protective mechanisms I hadn't known I possessed. I reached out and touched the artifact with my bare hand. The contact sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Several priests fell to their knees in prayer. Battle sisters raised their weapons, unsure whether to shoot me or the artifact. And Inquisitor Thanatos leaned forward with obvious fascination. The artifact screamed, not audibly, but with psychic feedback that made reality itself recoil. Where my skin contacted its surface, the corruption began to burn away like ice in sunlight. The whispered promises faded to whimpers, then silence. Within moments, the thing that had radiated malevolence powerful enough to corrupt entire worlds had become nothing more than inert metal and crystal. Impossible, the Inquisitor breathed. No one can purify chaos artifacts through direct contact. Even living saints require rituals, blessed weapons, intensive prayer. I looked down at my hand, where the artifact had left no mark despite its previous malevolence. I told you I've been having unusual experiences, I said, with carefully calculated humility. Perhaps this is another manifestation of whatever has been happening to me. The chamber erupted in excited theological discussion. Priests consulted ancient texts. Battle sisters compared my demonstration to recorded miracles of established saints. And throughout it all, I maintained an expression of confused gratitude for what appeared to be divine blessing. Inside, however, I was calculating the implications of what I'd just discovered. Whatever had brought me to this universe hadn't just transported me across dimensional boundaries. It had fundamentally altered my relationship with supernatural forces. I wasn't just Homelander anymore. I was something new. Something that this universe's cosmic forces recognized as genuinely holy. The question now was how to leverage this discovery into the galactic worship I deserved. Inquisitor Thanatos stood, her mechanical voice cutting through the theological chatter. By the authority vested in me by the Ordo Hereticus, I declare this individual free of heretical taint and potentially blessed by the God Emperor himself. He will be transferred to the ecclesiarchy for formal evaluation and possible recognition as a living saint. As the crowd began to disperse, I caught the Inquisitor studying me with mechanical intensity. "One word of warning," she said quietly. "Divine blessing is not a guarantee of righteousness. Saints have fallen to corruption before. Do not mistake divine favor for divine immunity." I nodded with appropriate solemnity while internally dismissing her concerns. I was Homelander, and now apparently something even more than that. Corruption was for lesser beings who lacked the inherent superiority to resist temptation. But as I was escorted from the chamber toward whatever formal evaluation involved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just passed the easy part of the test. The real challenges were still ahead, and in a universe where gods were real and actively hostile to each other, even genuine divine blessing might not be enough to guarantee success. Still, I was closer to galactic worship than I'd ever imagined possible. All I needed to do was continue proving my divine credentials while avoiding the various organizations that specialized in killing people who claimed supernatural authority without proper documentation. How hard could it be? Chapter 5. Sacred Politics. The Ecclesiarchy's headquarters on this world turned out to be less a building and more a city-sized monument to the concept of theological excess. The Cathedral Gloriana rose from the planet's surface like a mountain range, designed by someone with both unlimited resources and serious psychological issues regarding the appropriate scale for religious architecture. Sister Palatine Evangeline led me through corridors lined with stained glass windows that told the story of 10,000 years of imperial history in images too complex for normal human comprehension. Each window was a masterwork that would have been the centerpiece of any cathedral in my original world, but here they were just background decoration in an endless parade of artistic devotion. The Cardinal will see you in the Chamber of Sacred Contemplation, Evangeline explained, as we navigated through what appeared to be a library containing every religious text ever written in the galaxy. His Eminence Cardinal Maximilian has served the Emperor's will for over 3 centuries. Show proper respect. 3 centuries. Even with the life extension technology available to high-ranking imperial officials, that suggested someone with enough political skill to survive in a position where theological disagreements were often resolved through assassination. I made a mental note to be especially careful with my presentation. The Chamber of Sacred Contemplation was surprisingly modest compared to the cathedral's other spaces. Circular, with a domed ceiling painted to represent the Emperor's divine radiance, it contained only a simple altar, a few chairs, and walls lined with religious iconography from across the Imperium. Cardinal Maximilian himself was studying a holographic display showing what appeared to be reports from across the sector. He was ancient even by imperial standards, his augmented body more machine than flesh after centuries of service. His robes were magnificent works of art, woven with threads that caught and reflected light in ways that made his every movement seem blessed with divine illumination. When he turned to study me, his augmented eyes whirred with mechanical precision as they analyzed everything from my body language to my bioelectric field. "So," he said, in a voice that had been enhanced with harmonic modulators to make every word sound like a sacred hymn, "you are the one causing such excitement among my staff. Claims of divine visions, miraculous abilities, and now Inquisitor Thanatos reports that you purified a chaos artifact through touch alone." I bowed with what I hoped was appropriate reverence. "Your Eminence, I seek only to serve the Emperor's will and understand the nature of the experiences I've been having. Yes, humility is commendable." The Cardinal gestured for me to sit in the chair opposite his own. "But humility alone does not purify the unholy or repair blessed technology through will alone. Tell me, what do you believe is the source of your abilities?" This was the crucial question, and I'd prepared multiple answers depending on how the conversation developed. The Cardinal's enhanced eyes suggested he had access to sophisticated lie detection systems, so my response needed to be both truthful and carefully framed. "I don't know, Your Eminence. I've always had these abilities, but they've grown stronger since arriving on this world. The visions began recently. Images of the Golden Throne, sensations of vast presence watching over humanity. I can only conclude that proximity to such a faithful world has awakened something within me that responds to the Emperor's divine will. It was carefully crafted to suggest divine blessing while acknowledging my uncertainty about its nature." The Cardinal's mechanical features showed approval at my humble confession of limited understanding. "Interesting. And before these visions began, what was your relationship with the Imperial cult?" Another trap. Claiming to have been a lifelong faithful would be easily disproven, but admitting to no prior religious experience might suggest my current abilities were fraudulent. "I served the Emperor as any citizen should," I said carefully, "but I confess my understanding was limited. Recent events have shown me how much deeper the mysteries of faith truly are. A common experience among those called to greater service." The Cardinal nodded approvingly. "The Emperor reveals his will in stages, testing our worthiness before granting greater understanding." He activated the holographic display, showing what appeared to be personnel files and theological assessments. I've reviewed Inquisitor Thanatos' report extensively. Her analysis suggests your psychic signature is unlike anything in our records. Neither psychomanifestation nor technological augmentation, but something that appears to be genuinely supernatural in origin. The display shifted to show comparative data from verified living saints throughout Imperial history. Your pattern resembles these blessed individuals in key respects, but with significant differences that make classification challenging. What kind of differences? I asked, trying to project appropriate concern rather than curiosity about my own nature. Living saints typically develop their abilities gradually, often through suffering and martyrdom that deepens their connection to the Emperor's divine will. Your abilities appear to be innate, as if you were created rather than developed for this purpose. Created. The word carried implications that made me reassess everything about my situation. What if my arrival in this universe hadn't been accidental? What if whatever force had transported me here had deliberately chosen someone whose nature would resonate with Imperial theology? Furthermore, the Cardinal continued, your ability to purify chaos corruption through direct contact suggests a level of divine protection that exceeds most documented saints. That particular gift has been recorded fewer than a dozen times in Imperial history. He leaned forward, his mechanical features focusing with obvious intensity. Which brings us to the question of your future service. The Ecclesiarchy is prepared to offer you formal recognition as a miracle worker, with the possibility of advancement to full living saint status pending demonstration of additional divine gifts. The offer was everything I'd hoped for and more. Official recognition would provide legitimacy, resources, and access to the kind of galactic platform where I could begin building the worship I deserved. But something in the Cardinal's tone suggested there were conditions attached. What would such recognition entail? I asked. Service to the Imperium under Ecclesiarchy guidance, he replied smoothly. Miracle workers are assigned to locations where their gifts can serve the Emperor's will most effectively. Purifying corrupted worlds, inspiring Imperial forces in crucial battles, spreading faith among populations that have strayed from proper devotion. In other words, I would become a highly valuable asset to be deployed wherever the Ecclesiarchy deemed necessary. Useful for building my reputation, but potentially limiting in terms of personal autonomy. And if my gifts continue to develop, I asked, what would advancement to living saint status involve? The Cardinal's augmented features shifted into what might have been a smile. Living saints are granted considerable autonomy to pursue the Emperor's will as they understand it. They can establish shrines, gather followers, and even request Imperial military support for missions they deem crucial to humanity's survival. Now that was more like what I had in mind. The ability to gather followers and establish my own power base, backed by the military might of a galaxy-spanning empire. All I needed to do was prove myself worthy of such trust. I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity the Ecclesiarchy deems appropriate, I said with calculated humility. Excellent. The Cardinal stood, his robes rustling with mechanical precision. Your first assignment will be on the world of Sanctus Prima, where a chaos cult has been corrupting Imperial citizens through false promises of transcendence. Your purification abilities should prove educational for any heretics you encounter. A combat assignment, perfect for demonstrating my capabilities while building the kind of reputation that would support eventual advancement to full saint status. And dealing with actual chaos cultists would give me the chance to test the limits of my newfound abilities in a context where excessive force would be not just permitted, but encouraged. When do I depart? I asked. Within the week, Sister Palatine Evangeline will accompany you as theological advisor and liaison with local Imperial forces. You'll also be assigned a squad of battle sisters to assist with any situations that require conventional solutions. The meeting concluded with formal blessings and the kind of ceremonial pageantry that the Ecclesiarchy apparently considered essential for any official appointment. As I was escorted to quarters within the cathedral complex, I reflected on how quickly my situation had improved. Less than a week ago, I'd been dodging bolt guns and facing accusations of heresy. Now I was an officially recognized agent of the Imperium's religious hierarchy, with legitimate authority to pursue what they believed was the Emperor's divine will. The irony was perfect. In my original world, I'd been constrained by public relations concerns, corporate oversight, and legal limitations on what I could do to people who opposed me. Here, I was being given official sanction to use whatever force I deemed necessary against enemies of humanity, and if I played my cards correctly, this first assignment could be the foundation for building the kind of personal cult that would eventually overshadow even the Emperor's worship. After all, he was reportedly a silent corpse on a distant throne, while I was very much alive, very photogenic, and very eager to receive the adoration I deserved. That evening, as I reviewed intelligence reports about Sanctus Prima and its corruption problems, I began planning my approach to what I suspected would be my debut as the Imperial hero. The key would be balancing spectacular demonstrations of power with the kind of religious messaging that resonated with Imperial culture. Fortunately, I'd been managing my public image for years. The only difference now was that my target audience numbered in the quadrillions, and my competition included actual gods. But I was Homelander, and apparently something even more than that in this universe. I'd faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious through superior firepower and strategic presentation of my inherent superiority. How different could it be when the stakes were galactic rather than merely global? The answer to that question, I suspected, would become clear very soon. As I settled in for the night in quarters that were more luxurious than most noble houses in my original world, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction at how perfectly everything was falling into place. Soon, the entire galaxy would learn what happened when a real superior being decided to claim his rightful place among the stars. The Emperor might have 10,000 years of accumulated worship, but he'd never had to compete with someone who understood modern public relations, personal branding, and the art of making people love you through the strategic application of overwhelming force. This was going to be fun. Chapter 6: Baptism by Bolter Fire. Sanctus Prima was exactly the kind of hellscape that made me appreciate why Imperial citizens were so eager to embrace religious extremism as a lifestyle choice. The planet's surface was a wasteland of toxic storms and acid rain, forcing the population to live in massive underground complexes that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the irradiated soil. The corruption was immediately obvious even to someone with my limited experience in detecting chaos influence. The very air tasted wrong, carrying overtones of sweetness that made my enhanced senses recoil. Graffiti covered the tunnel walls, not the random vandalism you'd expect in any urban environment, but symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally, and slogans promising pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. Sister Palatine Evangeline briefed me as our shuttle descended through the planet's poisonous atmosphere. The corruption began 6 months ago in the factory districts, she explained, consulting data slates filled with surveillance reports and casualty figures. Workers started reporting strange dreams, increased productivity despite reduced sleep, and what they described as enhanced sensory experiences during their shifts. Slanesh, I said, recognizing the pattern from my research into the Chaos Gods. Confirmed. The Adeptus Arbites initially treated it as a productivity enhancement program, until workers began disappearing during off shifts and returning with modifications. Physical augmentations that weren't technological in nature, psychological changes that made them increasingly devoted to what they called the perfect assembly. She showed me surveillance footage that would have been banned in most civilized societies. Workers whose bodies had been restructured into forms that prioritized sensation over function. Manufacturing equipment that had grown organic components designed to maximize the pleasure derived from operating them, and assembly lines that produced goods with properties that defied scientific analysis. The local planetary governor attempted to contain the situation through conventional means, Evangeline continued. Quarantine protocols, Arbites enforcement actions, even a limited deployment of PDF forces. The corruption spread faster than containment efforts could be implemented. How many corrupted? Conservative estimates suggest 40% of the planetary population has been exposed to some level of chaos influence. Direct corruption affects approximately 15%, with numbers increasing daily. 15% of a hive world's population meant millions of people who had been fundamentally altered by exposure to forces that existed beyond normal reality. In my original world, that would have been a global catastrophe requiring intervention by every superhero organization on the planet. Here, it was apparently a Tuesday. Our landing zone was a staging area established by the local Adeptus Sororitas convent, surrounded by defensive positions and blessed barriers designed to prevent chaos corruption from affecting Imperial forces. The battle sisters who greeted us moved with the fluid efficiency of people who'd been fighting supernatural enemies for decades, their power armor gleaming with fresh purity seals and sacred unguents. Canoness. Superior Thalassa was everything I'd expected from someone charged with leading holy wars against cosmic corruption. Tall, imposing, and radiating the kind of absolute confidence that came from successfully purging heretics across multiple sectors, she examined me with enhanced optics that probably saw more than I was comfortable sharing. "So you're the miracle worker Cardinal Maximilian sent us," she said without preamble. "Sister Evangeline's reports suggest you can purify chaos corruption through direct contact." "That appears to be one of my abilities," I replied carefully, "though I'm still learning the extent of what I can do." "We'll find out quickly enough." She gestured toward a tactical display showing the underground complex's layout. "Intelligence indicates the corruption source is in manufacturing sector Gamma 7, approximately 15 kilometers from this position. The cult has established what they call a temple of perfect sensation in the primary assembly facility." The display showed surveillance footage from automated systems that had somehow avoided corruption. The assembly facility had been transformed into something that looked like a combination of factory floor and religious shrine, where production equipment had been merged with organic growths that pulsed with unnatural life. Our previous assault teams reported increasing difficulty maintaining combat effectiveness as they approached the corruption's epicenter. The Canoness continued. Sensory overload, compromised decision-making, and in several cases, voluntary conversion to the cult's beliefs. "What's the plan?" I asked. "Direct assault with you as our primary anti-corruption asset. We'll advance through the tunnel complex, purifying any corrupted areas you can handle, while my sisters deal with hostile contacts through conventional means." It was refreshingly straightforward compared to the complex political maneuvering I'd been navigating with the ecclesiarchy leadership. Go to the source of corruption, apply overwhelming force until the problem stopped existing, then bask in the grateful worship of the people I'd saved. The advance began at dawn, though dawn was a relative concept on a world where the sun's light couldn't penetrate the toxic atmosphere. Our force consisted of 2 squads of battle sisters, a unit of Adeptus Arbites who'd somehow avoided corruption, and several tech priests whose augmentations allowed them to function in environments that would drive normal humans insane. The first signs of corruption appeared within the first kilometer. Tunnel walls that had been decorated with standard Imperial iconography now bore symbols that seemed to shift when observed directly. The air grew thicker, carrying scents that ranged from pleasant to overwhelming, depending on your proximity to various organic growths that had sprouted from the rockcrete. Our first contact with corrupted cultists occurred in what had been a residential sector. They moved with fluid grace that would have been beautiful if not for the obvious wrongness of their enhanced physiology. Some had developed additional sensory organs that allowed them to perceive spectrums of light and sound beyond human comprehension. Others had been restructured to maximize their ability to experience physical sensation, their nervous systems exposed and modified to process stimuli with supernatural intensity. They sang as they attacked, their voices harmonizing in ways that made reality itself seem more vivid. The battle sisters responded with disciplined bolt gunfire, each shot accompanied by prayers that seemed to provide actual protection against the cult's influence. I let my team handle the conventional combat while I focused on the corruption itself. Where my hands touched contaminated surfaces, the chaos influence burned away like frost in sunlight. Organic growths withered and died. Twisted symbols reverted to standard Imperial iconography, and the oppressive wrongness that saturated the air began to clear. The effect on our forces was immediate and dramatic. Battle sisters who had been struggling against sensory overload suddenly moved with renewed precision. The tech priests' augmented systems stabilized as supernatural interference faded. Even the corrupted cultists seemed confused as their enhanced senses returned to merely human levels of acuity. "Remarkable," Canoness Thalassa said as I finished purifying a particularly corrupted section of tunnel. "I've seen sanctified flamers take hours to achieve what you accomplished in minutes." Word of our progress spread through the tunnel complex with the speed of genuine miracle. Uncorrupted citizens began emerging from hiding places, their faces showing the kind of religious awe usually reserved for direct divine intervention. Some fell to their knees as I passed, praising the Emperor for sending salvation to their world. It was exactly the kind of worship I'd always craved, but amplified beyond anything I'd experienced in my original world. These people didn't just admire my abilities. They saw me as the literal hand of their god, sent to deliver them from supernatural corruption that would have been unimaginable in any rational universe. The deeper we advanced, the stronger the corruption became. Manufacturing equipment had been fused with organic components that served no productive purpose beyond maximizing the sensory pleasure derived from operating them. Assembly lines had been restructured to create products whose geometry hurt to perceive directly. Items that existed primarily to demonstrate the cult's devotion to experiencing impossibly enhanced sensation. And throughout it all, the cultists fought with desperate fervor, defending their temple with the passion of people who genuinely believed they'd found transcendence through corruption. They weren't evil in any conventional sense. They were human beings who'd been offered experiences beyond normal comprehension and chosen to embrace them despite the obvious costs. The realization bothered me more than I'd expected. In my original world, the people I fought were usually motivated by greed, power, or simple malice. Here, I was purifying people whose only crime was wanting to feel more intensely than human physiology normally allowed. But as I watched Battle Sisters struggle against the cult's influence, their power armor beginning to show signs of organic modification as they were exposed to concentrated chaos energy, I understood why the Imperium treated this kind of corruption as an existential threat. These forces didn't just kill, they offered improvements that were genuinely attractive to anyone dissatisfied with the limitations of baseline human existence. And once you accepted those improvements, you became part of a larger pattern that ultimately served entities whose goals were incompatible with continued human existence. The temple itself was a masterwork of corrupted architecture. The assembly facility had been transformed into a space that existed partially in normal reality and partially in what appeared to be pure sensation given physical form. Manufacturing equipment had grown into organic shapes that pulsed with unnatural life, producing goods that served no purpose beyond demonstrating the infinite possibilities of enhanced experience. At the center of it all stood the cult's leader, a figure who had been so thoroughly modified by chaos influence that calling her human was generous. Her body had been restructured to maximize every possible form of sensory input, her nervous system exposed and enhanced to process stimuli at levels that should have caused immediate death. She spoke in voices that harmonized with themselves, creating acoustic effects that made her words seem to come from multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Welcome, Blessed One. We have felt your approach, tasted the purity you bring. Join us and know pleasure beyond description." The offer was accompanied by psychic pressure that made even my enhanced physiology react. For a moment, I could sense what the cultists experienced, sensation amplified beyond normal human comprehension, pleasure so intense it approached religious transcendence, the intoxicating possibility of experiencing everything the universe had to offer. And underneath it all, the subtle influence of something vast and malevolent that fed on mortal excess, growing stronger with each new convert to its philosophy of ultimate sensation. "I serve a different kind of transcendence," I said, advancing toward the cult leader while my heat vision began to charge. "The kind that comes through purification rather than corruption." The battle that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in either world. The cult leader fought with abilities that defied description, weaponizing pleasure itself, turning sensation into assault, making every attack feel like both agony and ecstasy combined. but my purification abilities seemed to disrupt her connection to whatever forces empowered her. Where my energy beams struck, the corruption burned away, leaving behind baseline human tissue that couldn't support the supernatural enhancements she'd acquired. She screamed as her modifications were stripped away, the sound-carrying harmonics of loss that made everyone present feel the echo of absolute deprivation. Then she collapsed, reduced to a confused and terrified woman who could barely remember why she'd chosen to embrace corruption in the first place. The effect on the remaining cultists was immediate and complete. Without their leader's influence to sustain the supernatural enhancements they'd received, they reverted to baseline human physiology. The organic growths throughout the facility withered and died. The assembly equipment returned to standard Imperial configurations. Within hours, the corruption that had threatened to consume an entire world was reduced to memory and scar tissue. As we emerged from the tunnel complex, I found myself surrounded by crowds of grateful citizens whose worship was so intense it approached the religious ecstasy I'd observed in the corrupted cultists. But where their devotion had been twisted by supernatural influence, this was pure human gratitude directed towards someone they genuinely believed had saved their souls. Canoness Thalassa's after-action report would describe the mission as a complete success achieved through divine intervention. Sister Evangeline's theological assessment would recommend my immediate advancement to full living saint status. And throughout the sector, word would spread of the miracle worker who could purify chaos corruption through will alone. But as I stood in the grateful crowds, accepting worship that exceeded anything I'd achieved in my original world, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just taken the first step down a path whose ultimate destination remained unclear. I was becoming something more than human in a universe where transcendence came with cosmic price tags that even superior beings might not be able to afford.